Okay, so let's look at the evidence kind of marshaled by Engerman and Sokoloff for their claims. So one place we'll see it is in immigration. So in your settler colonies, immigration is no problem. Come on over, set up a small scale farm. You know, no big deal. In your extractive colonies, you're not really going to want immigration. You're not going to want other Europeans there. You're not going to want to compete. Essentially, you have a very privileged status as a local elite, and you don't want to give that up. And so, and this is true kind of within the U.S. Like immigration, the North is much more favorable towards immigration than the South. They have much more favorable attitudes toward immigration than the South. And so we can see it in the white population over time, where U.S. and Canada essentially is encouraging immigration in this time period right here, whereas your Portuguese and then former Portuguese colonies and Spanish and former Spanish colonies are not. They're essentially restricting immigration from Europe, whereas the U.S. and Canada is encouraging it. Okay. When it comes to land, this is the big one. So as these countries expand inward and then expropriate the land from the native populations, they have to decide what to do with all this land they've taken. And in the US and Canada, they essentially open it up to any citizen. Any citizen can kind of go out there and get the land. And so we have the Homestead Act in the US, which says, if you go and you improve it, you own the land. It's similar in Canada. And also, I want you to notice when the Homestead Act passes, 1862, in the middle of the Civil War. Essentially, the South was opposed to this, to this act, and it could only be passed when the South was not in the Union. Okay, again, that difference, how these two areas of the U.S. took very different tracks and very different approaches to institutions. So basically, the U.S. essentially says they open up their interior, and they say, hey, if you want it, go ahead, you can have a piece of land. Whereas in Mexico and Brazil and Argentina, actually, they essentially grant those large swaths of land to to the existing elites. So it'd be in the U.S. if the U.S. once say the U.S. essentially expropriates I don't know Georgia or something, or the interior of Georgia from the Cherokee. They have that land, they've taken that land, they forcibly taken that land, and then they just decided to give it to the governor of Georgia. They say, okay, the governor, it's your land, or the governor's family, or the friends of the governor, they get that land. All right, that's essentially what happened in these former Spanish and Portuguese colonies, where the interior land, is granted to connected elites. And you can see this in the proportion of households that own land. Okay, to take a snapshot of Mexico in 1910, snapshot of the U.S. in 1900. High levels of land ownership throughout the U.S. So in the West, 83% of household heads own land. And in the North, about 80%. You can notice, actually, you can see the difference in institutions here. In the South, you have much lower levels of land ownership, still relatively high compared to Mexico, where in some of these places it's sub 5% of household heads own land. All right, so the land is essentially owned by just a few families in these areas. Another place we can see these institutions is in political rights. So your non-settler colonies essentially are not going to let people vote. They're going to expand the voting franchise much more slowly than your settler colonies. Right? And again, this is even true in the U.S. So even if the U.S. has kind of similar federal laws in voting in the antebellum period, there's much lower levels of participation in the South than there is in the North. Okay, but this is basically, so no is good. So no means more people can vote. So we have no secret. So there's a secret ballot in the U.S. There's no wealth requirement, and there's no literacy requirement for voting. By the time we get to 1850 and 1880, whereas basically all those are in place in these former Spanish colonies. Okay, so you have There's no secret ballot. So there's no secret ballot in most of these places, with the exception of Chile. There's wealth requirements. There's literacy requirements. Essentially, the franchise is being only given to the elites, where in the U.S. it's opened up more broadly. Okay, but there is, like I said, there is differences if you actually go and look at who's voting in terms of the percentage of the population that's eligible to vote, that actually votes. It's actually much lower in the South in this time period than it is in the North. So you see, there's a kind of other things that are going on that are, kind of keeping the existing elites in power. All right, institutions, schooling. So again, there's going to be broad scale investment in public schools or schooling in general in your settler colonies. Okay, and we can see this in the literacy rates in the U.S. and Canada. Another settler colony is Canada, and so you can see very high literacy rates. If you go to these former Spanish colonies here, and actually a former English colony, you can see much lower rates. So it's not just an England-Spain thing; it's really a settler versus extractive difference. And so you can see much lower rates of literacy there. Okay, and so the whole idea here is your extractive colonies are wealthy initially when you're dealing in a zero sum world. All right, so remember, first lectures, when you're in a zero sum world, when the primary resource is land or resources like mineral wealth, when that is all there is, all right, then your extractive colonies are going to be richer because they have the resources. Okay, they have the valuable minerals are all in extractive colonies. Sugar is the valuable crop, that is an extractive colony. Those are going to be the areas that are rich initially. Once the economy switches from being zero sum to dynamic to being driven by innovation, your places with a quality of opportunity, with an educated populace that has access to the market, that can start businesses, that is going to be the place that has growth. So once industrialization happens, once the industrial revolution occurs, and your England's, your Netherlands, and then your former colonies are able to switch to innovation, to essentially become places where innovation happens, and therefore growth happens. The places that have those settler institutions, that have inherited those settler institutions, are going to be the places where that innovation goes to. If you're thinking about your extractive colony, you got your small group of elite. The whole system's working well for that small group of elite. All right. This is why there's no incentive to change in many of these places. For the elites that hold all the economic and political power, the system is working for them. All right. Their lives are great. Um, so when innovation, when the world switches to innovation, that is really driven by human capital, and access to the market. In those existing places with that small group of elite, there's no broad-based schooling, or the schooling is poor, because essentially there's no incentive from the elite's perspective to enact that sort of reform. Their kids are all going to some private school, or they're getting elite, if in these early time periods they're getting like elite tutors or something like that, some nice tutors coming to teach them. They can start a business if they want, if they want to do some new venture, they can do that. um, but if the average person wants to do that, they're kind of locked out by these barriers to entry. And so in these places that are former extractive colonies, they're not going to have the dynamism and the innovation that comes to the settler colonies, where you have high levels of human capital, and an ability to enter the market, the ability to try to innovate, to try to come up with some new thing that really is the engine of growth once we get industrialization. And that then engenders this switch where your formerly poor colonies, your settler colonies, become the fast growing regions and ultimately surpass the extractive colonies. All right. That is Ingerman and Sokolov's theory about the path of the Americas, you know, distilled down. All right. Again, you'll read the article itself, and hopefully it all makes sense. Again, it's the institutional theory of growth, and it has lots of critics. So if you don't buy it, you can certainly find lots of critiques of the Ingerman and Sokolov kind of institutional theory, or endowments leading to institutions, then that feeding into growth. You can find critiques of it if you want. But that's the paper.